For the last week or so, the Israel and Palestine war has been flooding our news feeds and creating widespread division around the world. From tragic deaths and injuries to footage of bombings to protests across the globe, many are wondering how this even began. While the conflict and devastation might come as a surprise or a confusing situation to some, this war has actually been going on for a very long time. In fact, it is all part of the wider Israel-Arab conflict, which is one of the world's longest continued fights, beginning in the 1900s. This is a long, bitter dispute over land, entitlements, freedom, religion and culture. In the 19th century, a movement called Zionism emerged, which was a desire for the Jewish people to have a national home for themselves. During World War I in 1917, the British government expressed support that Palestine should be the home for Jewish people. This statement was known as the Balfour Declaration. But this was not an idea welcomed by the Palestinian people.
So we had a situation in which you had two national movements, an Arab-Palestinian national movement already on the ground in Palestine, and then a newly arrived Jewish national movement, basically rising side by side with hardly any interaction with one another, and competing for the same territory, for the same piece of land.
In 1947, 2 years after the Second World War and the Holocaust, there was still heavy conflict between the Arab people and the Jewish people living amongst each other in Palestine. Britain decided to hand over control of the Palestine problem by offloading the situation to the United Nations. The UN wanted to split the state into two. This would be known as Resolution 181. The idea was there to be an Arab state and a Jewish state of Palestine. But Palestine refused to accept this because they felt that the Jews were being favoured as Arabs would have to live in Jewish territory. This further intensified fighting.
Post-World War II, the feeling among the world community, international leaders like Truman, Churchill and others was that there's a need to establish a homeland for the Jewish people. And there was a sense that the best way to do it is to partition the land between Arabs and Jews in mandatory Palestine, meaning ending the British mandate over Palestine and then establishing two states, Jewish and Arab. The Jewish community of Palestine accepted it with some caveats. The Arab community in Palestine rejected the partition plan.
A year later, in 1948, the Jewish state became independent, officially becoming Israel. The independence of Israel prompted the beginning of the Arab-Israeli War, which included 5 Arab states: Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria and Iraq. This conflict included air attacks on Tel Aviv, an invasion of Israel by Arab countries, and the mass exodus of Palestinians fleeing their land.
So 1948 is a pivotal moment in history. For Israelis, it's the liberation war, the independence war. It's a joyous moment in Jewish history and Israeli history. For Arabs, for Palestinians, it's known as the Nakba, the catastrophe in which over 700,000 Palestinians fled from their homes, some in their own free will or adhering to Arab states' calls to leave, and others that were forced out. And so that was the Nakba, the catastrophe, the birth of the Palestinian refugee issue, the fact that Palestinians dispersed all over the land, whether to Jordan, to the West Bank, to the Gaza Strip, to the Gulf, to Lebanon, and Syria. So that's kind of a moment. And that Israelis find themselves practically overnight from a minority in the land to a majority of 600,000 Jews and about 150,000 Arabs. And that's how Israel began.
In 1967, a 6-day war broke out between Israel and its Arab neighbours. The conflict saw Israel occupy the rest of Palestine, including Jerusalem, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. While it was a successful 6-day war for Israel, it resulted in a majority of Palestinians becoming refugees.
So Israel decided June 5th, 1967, to launch a preemptive strike. And that's how it began the 6-day war, known as the June 1967 war, in which Israel was fighting on 3 fronts: Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and practically, again, within 6 days, conquered the Sinai from Egypt, conquered the Golan Heights from Syria, and conquered the West Bank and East Jerusalem that was under Jordanian control. Israel almost more than doubled its size within 6 days. That's how Israeli occupation began of the West Bank and Gaza. 1967 led to another generation of refugees, Palestinians fleeing. That's about, according to UN data, it's about around 300,000 additional Palestinians that fled after 1967.
In 1987, Palestinians fought back. This part of the long war was known as the First Intifada and saw Palestinians engage in an uprising in Israeli-occupied areas. Angry with the Israeli government and military, Palestinians wanted their territories back, so they staged protests and violent riots.
For the first time, Palestinians take matters into their own hands, and spontaneously protests begin, first in the Gaza Strip, and then they spill over into the West Bank, fighting against Israeli occupation, resisting occupation, fighting Israeli soldiers, and wanting to make a point that Palestinians are there. They want a state. They want their national aspirations to be fulfilled. They want the right to self-determination. And so Israel faces, for about 4 years between 1987 and 1991, this what's known as the First Intifada, the uprising. This particular uprising was spontaneous. It ends in 1991 as the Gulf War begins, and then negotiations begin a bit later, but that's how it ends.
This series of conflicts continued until 1993, when Israel's then Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, and leader of Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, signed what is referred to as the Oslo Accord at the White House.
Oslo was the first time in which Israel and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, mutually recognized one another, and it paved the way for an agreement known as the Oslo Accords, or the Declaration of Principles, which states basically a continued, while recognizing one another, working together for an interim period of 5 years, trying to address all the outstanding issues between Israelis and Palestinians. It was a good idea on paper, but then unfortunately violence took over. Hamas was then came to the forefront and led a series of suicide bombing attacks, derailing the peace process.
However, in the year 2000, the Second Intifada began, which went for nearly 5 years until 2005. It was another uprising staged by Palestinians against Israel. There were mass casualties on both sides, which included tank and aerial attacks, suicide bombings and rocket assaults. However, it resulted in Palestine gaining control of the West Bank and Gaza as Israel disengaged from Gaza.
What happened in 2000 was specifically that there was a summit in Camp David hosted by President Bill Clinton. He hosted Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian chairman, PLO chairman Yasser Arafat, trying to broker a deal addressing all the core issues of the conflict: Jerusalem, refugees, territory, security, settlements. There were far-reaching proposals by Israel. Arafat rejected it, and then Camp David fell apart. But then violence broke out in a more organized way, with forces of the Palestinian Authority, of the PLO, or associated with them, taking part in them. This was a bloody intifada, 4 years, over 1,000 Israeli casualties, thousands of Palestinian casualties.
In 2006, 1 year after the Second Intifada, Palestinian terrorist organisation Hamas won an election to control the Gaza Strip, ousting the Palestine Liberation Organization. Because Hamas now controlled the area, Israel and Egypt imposed a blockade on the Gaza Strip, which meant goods and services, including food and energy, would be restricted from entering the area. But this area, which is now home to 2 million Palestinians, is a humanitarian catastrophe.
In the parliamentary elections, Hamas won, and then all of a sudden a new reality was created in which Hamas was officially in a leading role. That made it very difficult for the international community to support the Palestinians as Hamas was there. But then what happened was that Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, handing it over to the Palestinian Authority, basically. And in 2007, Hamas ousted the Palestinian Authority, taking control of the Gaza Strip, which it controls until this very day. Hamas launches rockets into Israel. Israel responds, Hamas responds, and we enter this cycle of violence, so-called. A ceasefire is established after a week, 3 weeks, at one point, a month and a half, and then everything back to normal. There was no attempt made at resolving the Gaza issue, not by the international community, not by Israel.
Since 2007, the conflict between Israel and Hamas has continued with a number of flashpoints. The UN has reported since 2008 over 6,000 Palestinians and 3,000 Israelis have been killed in attacks. Over the years, both Israel and Hamas have launched missiles and large-scale military operations.
Humanitarian assistance was allowed, and Israel did work with UN agencies and other international community members and NGOs to allow humanitarian assistance to flow despite this animosity. At times of war or times of fighting, we've seen at least 5 rounds of fighting before this current one, then humanitarian assistance, was limited. But at no point did Israel bring to an end humanitarian assistance. It continued to allow humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip throughout. And even until very recently, Israel, was issuing work permits for thousands of people from Gaza to work in Israel.
And here we are in October 2023, where the conflict has drastically escalated. Over 1 week ago, Hamas launched a surprise attack against the Israeli people, capturing worldwide attention. 5,000 rockets were sent from the Gaza Strip as far as to Tel Aviv, while Hamas soldiers crossed into Israel, killing hundreds of innocent civilians and taking many hostage. Israel retaliated, declaring war and launching their own attacks. But why now? What has happened for Hamas to quietly be planning its attack on Israel?
It's definitely a surprise attack, unprecedented. Nobody expected it. It was known that Hamas has such plans in the drawer, but nobody thought that they would actually happen at this point. And when it finally did happen, it caught Israelis by surprise. This was a systematic failure by the government, by the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, by the intelligence community. And so why did it happen? Hamas, I think, first of all, wanted to inflict pain on Israel, wanted to embarrass Israel, wanted to take Israeli hostages because it knows it gives it a lot of leverage. And it also, I think, wanted to derail the Arab-Israeli normalization that we've seen going on since 2020, the Abraham Accords, and now all the talk about possible Saudi-Israeli normalization. And so I think that this was kind of what instigated that.